The Aeon 2 Open and the Aeon 2 Closed are the successor to Dan Clark Audio's Aeon Flow series headphones, and in this video we'll be comparing the open and the closed back model to see which one performs the best. Let's check them out. Hey everyone, I'm Chrono from the Headphone Show, and today with me I have the Aeon 2 Open and the Aeon 2 Closed, which were loaned out to me for review and comparison by Headphones.com. The Aeon 2 Open and Closed both retail for $8.99, and they feature redesigned driver technologies that, according to Dan Clark Audio, improve airflow resolution and dynamics when compared to their Aeon Flow predecessors. Both the Aeon 2 Open and the Aeon 2 Closed come in at an impedance of 13 ohms and a sensitivity level of 94 dB per milliwatt and 92 dB per milliwatt respectively. In practice, I actually found that these required quite a bit of power before opening up, and they were the only headphones thus far that I've had to use the second gain stage with the micro black label and the high gain setting on the JDS Labs Element 2. Moving along to packaging, you get a couple of nice accessories with the Aeon 2. For starters, you get what Dan Clark Audio calls their dumber cable, which uses high-rose connectors on the headphone side and terminates in 3.5mm with a thread-on 1/4-inch adapter on the amplifier side. With the Aeon 2, you also get a custom-molded hardshell case that is very compact and ideal for travel. Lastly, you get 3 different sets of filters that you can place inside the ear cups to slightly refine the Aeon 2's sound more to your preference. More on how these effects sound though later in the EQ section. The build on the Aeon 2 is fantastic, and I think it's excellent visually and in its construction. For a planar magnetic headphone, they're extremely light at only 327 grams, and they also feature a collapsible folding mechanism that further reduces its footprint. I also appreciate the different materials used in the Aeon 2's design, which help in making this one of the most durable and sturdy feeling headphones that I've tried. I really don't have any complaints for the build and design of this headphone. I just wish that the glossy paint and carbon fiber inserts weren't such fingerprint magnets. Comfort is another one of the Aeon 2's strong suits. The ear cups follow the shape of the ear, and while they look a little narrow, I had no issues getting a good fit with them without having my ears touch the inner sides of the pads. The pads themselves are fairly deep and are wrapped in a very nice feeling protein leather that, in my experience, generated less heat buildup than I usually get when compared to lambskin pads. My only complaint for comfort is that the clamp force out of the box is a little on the stronger side, but it did go away after a week or so of use. With the basics out of the way, we now get to talk about how these two headphones sound, and I really didn't know what to expect from them since this was actually my first experience with Dan Clark Audio headphones. After a while listening to them though, I have to say that they have each surprised me in their own unique way. So despite being very similar, I mean in terms of appearance, the only real difference is that the closed version has the carbon fiber inserts because they close up the driver, and the open has partially perforated pads. But despite being seemingly identical headphones, one of these had me going, whoa, I like that, whilst the other one had me thinking like, ooh, I really don't like that. So yeah, without further ado, let's talk about how these two headphones sound. Okay, so for frequency response, let's start off by talking about the bass. And first up, it's the Aeon 2 Open because I find that it's the more interesting of the two headphones. So I'll describe the Aeon 2 Open as having a V-shaped sound signature, but it has this really exaggerated rightward skew. So it makes the bass on the Aeon 2 Open remarkably overbearing. It has like this very wide elevation at around 130 Hz that is like an excess of almost 10 dB, and it just makes low tones come across as extremely boomy and bloated. I understand wanting to add, more bass presence to make it more fun or a bit of warmth, but I feel like it's just way too overdone on the Aeon 2 Open. And because it's a wide elevation, it bleeds severely into the lower mids, and it makes low midtones, low vocal, piano, guitar tones between 250 to 500 Hz sound extremely congested and undefined. Now, the Aeon 2 Open does have some good qualities in the bass, like good level of detail, and it has very good planar extension that makes the bass on these very deep. However, I feel like those qualities are really made irrelevant because of the stock bass tuning, which just makes the listening experience on the Aeon 2 Open kind of muddy. The Aeon 2 Closed, by comparison, it still has a touch of warmth at 130 Hz, but it's a lot more subtle, and I actually think that it can be quite enjoyable on some tracks as it adds a nice mid-bass punch without actually upsetting or getting in the way of other frequencies in the mix. I still feel as though the upper bass creeps ever so slightly into the lower mid-range, but it's nowhere near to the extent of this is on the Aeon 2 Open, and it's honestly barely noticeable. So yeah, this was actually very surprising to me because I usually always expect the closed back version of any given headphone to be, you know, more bassy, have less controlled bass, but it was actually the Aeon 2 Close that had the significantly more balanced and clean sounding bass when compared to the Aeon 2 Open. Now, overall, for like detail and resolution in the bass on the Aeon 2 Open, especially when you EQ it, because otherwise I don't really think that that quality shines through. But yeah, for resolution, I think that they're actually very well articulated in the lows, although I still found the Hi-Fi Man Ananda LCD2 Classic, LCD2, and LCD GX to be just a little bit better defined in this region of the frequency response. Moving on to mid-range, we'll start talking again about the Aeon 2 Open, of which mids very easily get lost in the mix when compared to the elevated bass and treble on this headphone. So the mids here, I feel like that upper bass bleed into the lower mids completely overpowers the rest of the mid-range, so it just gives it this strange sort of stuffy tonality. You know, vocals lack presence, electric guitars sound very distant, brass instruments have no bite, and it generally just feels like the only thing letting you know that those vocals and instruments are there is their overblown harmonics and overtones in the treble region. And I think that that just gives the Aeon 2 Open a very off-putting, unnatural tonality. The Aeon 2 Closed mid-range is not perfect either, but I feel like it's presented in a much more enjoyable and pleasant way than on the Aeon 2 Open, and more importantly, it actually never struck me as sounding particularly unnatural. So these, I feel, have a lot better body and substance in the mids than the Aeon 2 Open, and the only thing that I really found was a little, you know, odd was that there seemed to be this very wide recession between 1.5 to 5.5K of around 3 to 4 dB in the upper mid-range. So some of the energy there in the presence region for vocals and instruments was taken away, and it also made the mid-range on these sound a little hazy and less resolving than it actually is. Now, both the Aeon 2 Open and Close sound to me like they have very good sense of clarity in the mid-range, although I did think that, at least to me, it sounded like the Aeon 2 Close was actually the one that had slightly cleaner detail retrieval. And compared to other headphones in its price range, I actually think these perform really well. So I actually think that this headphone, the Aeon 2 Close, has a more resolving mid-range than the Hi-Fi Man Ananda and Odyssey LCD2 Classic. I think it's only edged out really by the LCD GX and standard LCD2. And another thing I wanted to mention was that these have a timbre that is surprisingly reminiscent of that of dynamic driver headphones. So I think that compared to the other headphones in this price range, the Planar ones, I think that they actually sound a little bit more natural, which is a very interesting quality. For the last section of the frequency response, we of course have the highs, and even though both the Aeon 2 Open and Close share some similar characteristics here in the highs, their presentations end up sounding completely different. So they both have peaks at 6 and 8.5K, but they're significantly more exaggerated on the Aeon 2 Open as they're greater in magnitude and a lot wider. And I feel as though this excess in treble makes the Aeon 2 Open's highs come across as, you know, harsh, sibilant, piercing, and as I mentioned earlier, harmonics and overtones are blown, you know, extremely out of proportion, and they just sound very unnatural, and it also introduces a sizzle-like quality. On the other hand, we have the Aeon 2 Close, of which peaks are significantly smaller and narrower by comparison. So there is a fair bit of glare that's introduced by the peak at 6K, although surprisingly it didn't sound particularly sibilant to me in that region of the lower treble. Now, the 8.5K peak can occasionally introduce some sibilance on consonant sounds, and it can be a little bit piercing at times, but it was nowhere near as bothersome or fatiguing as on other headphones like the DT1990 Pro or the Aeon 2 Open. One quality that I did find that they shared pretty much identically was that it seems to me, or at least for my preference, I feel like there's just a little bit too much energy in the air region above 10K. So I felt as though vocals had a little bit too much of that upper treble glisten, and it wasn't offensive, but I did think that it made them sound just a little bit unnatural. Lastly, for the treble region, we have resolution. I actually think that both the Aeon 2 Open and Closed perform really well in this regard. I actually think that they're both a little bit more resolving than the LCD2 Classic and just fall slightly behind the Hi-Fi Man and Nando, which I think is great considering, especially for this, again, considering that it's a closed back to have this good treble resolution, I think it's great. Moving on to soundstage imaging and layering, I think that these are some interesting categories for the Aeon 2 Open and Closed because they actually present their soundstage pretty much in the exact same way. And that isn't to say that the Closed is a very open sounding headphone. That's to say that the Aeon 2 Open is actually a very closed sounding headphone. So they both have this very intimate presentation that I think is actually even narrower than what you get on an HD600 series headphone from Sennheiser. So in terms of width, they're definitely a little underwhelming and not the most impressive, but I still found that their imaging was actually very clean. Telling which direction sounds were originating from, that was very easy. And I never felt like there were any gaps in any place of the soundstage. So if sounds were panning from right to left, it was actually very smooth. So at least for imaging, they perform really well. And I think actually even more impressive is their ability to separate the instruments. Their instrument separation is great, especially when you consider that they have such a small soundstage to play with. I never felt like any instruments, vocals got lost, even during busy passages. If anything, it felt like every element in the mix had its own very well-defined space. So it's a small, intimate presentation, but I think it's still enjoyable because it manages to not feel, at least to me, claustrophobic or cramped. Now, if there's one category where the Aeon 2 Closed and Open seriously suffer, it's in dynamics. So if you're looking for a headphone with very good punch and slam, you're not going to be getting that here. So low notes, they don't really deliver that satisfying physical impact that you get on something like, Focal or Odyssey headphones. But at least I still thought that they were very capable of reproducing that top end attack behind like things like drum strikes, keystrokes, or even like that top end sort of bite that strong instruments have. So in that sense, they were able to do that fine, but these are not going to be the most fun or engaging for dynamics. Now, as I usually do before wrapping up a review, I want to talk about EQ for the Aeon 2 Closed and Open, but also talk about the filters and inserts that are included with the Aeon 2, as in a way there's sort of an analog EQ. So with the Aeon 2, you get 3 sets of filters that provide different levels of damping. So you get a set of foam filters, which are the lightest, and then there's 2 sets of felt filters, of which the white are the densest and provide the most damping. So when you put these on, I feel like they target mostly the peak at 8.5K, and they do it fairly well, but they do have some negative repercussions for the resolution of the headphones. So it seems to me as though when using the filters, the resolution in the bass and the mids in particular seems to be, they lose a little bit of their cleanliness, and how much resolution is sacrificed varies with each filter. And the denser the filter, the more resolution you sacrifice, which is an unfortunate trade-off incurred by the use of front damping, but at least it allows for some user preference. Now, for DSP EQ, I'll start off by talking about the Aeon 2 Open because I feel like that's the one that most desperately needs it. So I use a couple of different low shelf filters to tame the bass a little bit and bring it back to more normal levels, as well as reduce some of that congestion in the lower mid-range. Additionally, I actually use some pretty drastic peak adjustment filters in the treble to get rid of the sibilants and Pierce. Now, after EQ, the Aeon 2 Open sounds significantly more natural, but for some reason there was this sort of strange, harsh quality in the treble that no matter what combination of EQ and included filter inserts I used, it didn't seem to go away. Now, the Aeon 2 Closed, I actually don't feel like it's a headphone that needs EQ. I actually enjoy it quite a bit by just using the one-notch filter that's included with these. But of course, I have made an EQ profile for it that targets specifically the upper mid-range to bring it back a little, give it a little more presence energy, as well as reduce some of the peakiness at 6 and 8.5K. So as always, if you'd like to try out my EQ profile for the Aeon 2 Closed or the Aeon 2 Open, that will be available in my EQ profile compilation, which I posted on the Headphones community forums. And again, the link to that will be in the description down below. So to finally wrap up the video, what are my thoughts on these two headphones? Well, for starters, I have to say that I feel like the Aeon 2 Closed is a refinement over the Aeon 2 Open in every single way. I'm really hard pressed to find a scenario in which I would, choose or even recommend the Open over the Closed, and that's with or without EQ. I just don't feel as though the Aeon 2 Open brings the benefits that I usually associate with going from closed back to open, and instead I just feel like it misses out on all the things that the closed back has to offer. And they both have a somewhat similar tonality in that they have accentuated highs and very present bass, but it's just presented in a much better, enjoyable, and pleasant way on the Aeon 2 Closes, at least for me. And to me, the Aeon 2 Open just sounded overly dark and at the same time strangely shrill. So yeah, if you're gonna choose between one of these two headphones, I feel like the only one you should be looking at is the Aeon 2 Closed. Then last thing, I also wanted to mention that if you're looking for a headphone between $700 and $1,000, a planar magnetic, I truly believe that the Aeon 2 Closed should be a top contender in your shortlist. I feel like it offers a very unique experience with good tonal and technical performance delivered in a very compact, lightweight, portable, closed back package. Anyways, that is all from me today. I hope you enjoyed this video or found it helpful. If you did, do consider dropping a like. And if you want to learn more about the Aeon 2 Open and Closed or other headphones, I highly encourage you to check out the review section available on headphones.com. For more headphone and audio content, stay tuned by subscribing to the Headphone Show on YouTube. Until next time, this is Chrono signing off.